Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Complex Cinema channel. Please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button. Today, we are going to be discussing the movie No More Bets from 2023. The narrative centers on Pan Xing, a promising young software engineer whose dedication to his craft is palpable. He's the kind of talent that major tech firms actively court, possessing an almost obsessive focus on creating elegant, functional code, a trait that hints at the disciplined mind needed for a life that will soon spiral. He falls deeply for Na Ying, a brilliant mathematician whose academic achievements suggest a future shaping theoretical science. Yet her ambitions seem subtly tethered to the practical comforts that modern life promises. Their comfortable existence, built on Pan Xing's legitimate, if demanding, work developing high-frequency trading algorithms, a field where milliseconds equate to fortunes, is disrupted by the arrival of Lu Wei, a shadowy figure who operates in the opaque world of online gambling platforms. Lu Wei, with the smooth, predatory charm of someone who has mastered the art of persuasive deception, recognizes the raw potential in Pan Xing's coding abilities far beyond the legitimate stock market. He sees a master architect for a digital casino empire, one designed not for entertainment, but for systematic extraction. Lu Wei offers Pan Xing a staggering sum, appealing to the engineer's desire for impact, and, perhaps more cynically, for a life unburdened by the slow climb of conventional success. Initially, Pan Xing hesitates, the moral weight of building mechanisms designed to financially ruin people pressing against his conscience. However, the allure of rapid wealth, the temptation to prove his technical mastery on a grand scale, and the subtle pressure exerted by Lu Wei's relentless persuasion, who frames the work as merely sophisticated system design, eventually win out. He convinces himself it is just complex programming. The operation is set up in Southeast Asia, a labyrinthine digital fortress where Pan Xing builds the back-end infrastructure for what becomes a massive, highly addictive online betting operation. The system is terrifyingly effective. It learns user habits, adjusts odds invisibly, and ensures the house always, inevitably, wins. As the platform expands, so does Pan Xing's gilded cage. He is now immensely wealthy, living a life of curated luxury, but completely insulated from the real-world consequences of his creation. Na Ying, drawn in by the sudden opulence, eventually joins him, perhaps believing the money stems from legitimate, albeit high-stakes, financial success, or choosing willful ignorance to maintain the lifestyle. The turning point arrives with the introduction of a new, desperate user, a technician named Hai. Hai is financially ruined by the platform, his life collapsing under the weight of inescapable debt fueled by the system Pan Xing built. Witnessing the direct, devastating human cost, perhaps through an overheard conversation or a piece of leaked information, jolts Pan Xing from his detached developer mindset. The theoretical elegance of his code is suddenly stained with real-world tragedy. The realization forces a confrontation with his own complicity. He understands that his initial small concessions to Lu Wei have morphed into the central pillar of a vast, predatory enterprise. Pan Xing begins secretly plotting an exit, not just for himself and Na Ying, but for the trapped users. He risks everything to develop a backdoor, a piece of countercode designed to expose the platform's manipulation, or, at the very least, allow users a fighting chance to withdraw funds. This rebellion does not go unnoticed. Lu Wei, whose ruthlessness is matched only by his paranoia, suspects the betrayal. The luxury turns toxic. The security detail becomes imprisonment. Pan Xing and Na Ying find themselves running for their lives, stripped of their guards and their digital sanctuary. The climax involves a desperate flight, a cat-and-mouse chase where Pan Sheng must use his intimate knowledge of the network infrastructure, the very world he helped create, to evade capture by Lu Wei's operatives. The climax is less about triumphant destruction and more about survival and confession. In the end, the illusion shatters completely. Whether they manage to bring the entire structure down or merely escape its immediate clutches, the cost is the total demolition of their former lives and the realization that true value cannot be coded into existence. It must be earned through difficult, honest choices. The final scenes often imply a return to a stark reality, the wealth vaporized, leaving only the difficult path toward atonement. Pan Sheng's initial foray into coding was characterized by a quiet intensity, the kind of deep concentration that suggests an engineer who sees the world as solvable problems waiting for the right algorithm. He wasn't driven by avarice initially, but by the sheer intellectual challenge of optimizing systems, a pursuit that led him naturally to the high-stakes, lightning-fast environment of legitimate algorithmic trading. He carried the earnest belief that technology was a neutral tool, capable of great efficiency. Na Ying, meanwhile, possessed a luminous intellect, her mind drawn to the precision of numbers, yet she was equally captivated by the veneer of success that modern capital could buy, a subtle, perhaps unconscious, yearning for stability that the academic life rarely provides. Lu Wei entered their orbit like a ripple in still water, a man whose tailored suits and practiced smile hid the calculating coldness of a seasoned predator. He didn't pitch a job. He presented an invitation to build a fortress of finance, albeit one constructed on sand and deceit. Lu Wei's flattery was particularly potent, because it validated Pan Sheng's talent on a scale far grander than the relatively small fluctuations of the legitimate stock market. He didn't ask Pan Sheng to cheat. He asked him to design the ultimate self-regulating system, promising a creative freedom that legitimate compliance departments would never allow. The justification Pan Sheng clung to was thin, a rationalization that the platform was merely providing a service people willingly engaged in, ignoring the engineered addiction at its core. Once established in the Southeast Asian hub, the facility was less an office and more a sterile monument to digital control. Pan Sheng's code became the nervous system of the platform, his routines subtly tilting the scales. The architecture was beautiful in its mathematical cruelty. It mapped user impulses with chilling accuracy, creating feedback loops that maximized loss. He began to inhabit a bubble of manufactured reality. The wealth flowed in torrents, financing a life of curated experiences, imported art, silent drivers, and apartments overlooking glittering indifferent cities. For a time, Na Ying seemed content, wrapped in the security, perhaps finding solace in the sheer tangibility of their success, overlooking the shadows at the edges of the balance sheets. The moment of true reckoning arrived not through an abstract moral treatise, but through the visceral sight of human wreckage embodied by Ah Hai. Ah Hai wasn't a theoretical statistic. He was a real man, broken by debt, whose desperation reached Pan Sheng perhaps through an intercepted, panicked message or a hushed conversation among the platform's low-level administrators. Seeing the tangible, non-reversible damage inflicted by his elegant functions, the ruined families, the lost livelihoods, cracked Pan Sheng's detachment. The realization was sickening. He wasn't just optimizing, he was systematically dismantling lives for profit. His ambition curdled into profound self-loathing. The pivot was agonizingly slow and inherently dangerous. Pan Sheng had to work in the dead of night, his fingers flying across the keys, building the very trap he intended to spring. Every line of countercode was a silent scream against his previous work, a direct act of treason against Lu Wei. He sought not just to flee, but to undo, to inject a measure of chaotic fairness back into the system. Na Ying, perhaps sensing the shift in the atmosphere, the unspoken tension that replaced their carefree exchanges, began to understand the true source of their gilded prison, her own complicity hardening into fear. When Lu Wei inevitably discovered the sabotage, likely through monitoring unusual server activity or the subtle tremor in Pan Sheng's once perfect compliance, the environment instantly turned hostile. The plush carpets and imported veneers became irrelevant. They were suddenly surrounded by threats. The escape was not heroic. It was desperate, ragged, fueled by adrenaline and the chilling knowledge that their pursuers were as smart and ruthless as Pan Sheng himself, but without any shred of moral restraint. They were forced to rely on Pan Sheng's innate understanding of the network infrastructure, using backdoors and exploiting blind spots he himself had intentionally left, to navigate a digital maze turned deadly physical pursuit. The final moments were a blur of compromised safety and the shedding of every material possession that had bought their silence, leaving them with the heavy, undeniable burden of accountability in a world that no longer recognized their fabricated success. Pan Sheng, in his early days, possessed the quiet zeal of an artisan perfecting his craft. His initial attraction to algorithmic trading was purely intellectual, a quest to harness the chaotic energy of the market into predictable, efficient structures. He saw code as logic made manifest, a clean world far removed from messy human compromise. Na Ying, sharp and grounded by her mathematical training, appreciated the elegance of their growing fortune, viewing it as the inevitable reward for intellectual superiority, a tangible validation that the purely theoretical realm of academia often denied. Lu Wei was the embodiment of leveraged charisma. He didn't shout about profits. He spoke softly of scale and influence, positioning Pan Sheng's engineering talent not as mere programming, but as the creation of a new societal mechanism, albeit one operating outside established rules. Lu Wei recognized that Pan Sheng's moral hesitation was merely a lack of sufficient scope. Once the project was big enough, the ethics would seem like petty local regulations. The justification Pan Sheng adopted was a classic evasion. He was building a sophisticated tool for willing participants, deflecting responsibility for the inevitable user behavior his tool was designed to exploit. The offshore operation became Pan Sheng's self-imposed purgatory, a high-tech bunker where time was measured in server uptime and cascading losses. His algorithms were masterful, self-optimizing entities that learned to prey on the momentary weakness of human hope, turning fleeting confidence into permanent debt. The resulting wealth was suffocatingly insulating. He observed the world from behind tinted glass, his conscience lulled by the sheer volume of luxury. Na Ying, perhaps initially seduced by the freedom from financial anxiety, eventually settled into the routine, her sharp mind choosing to ignore the logical inconsistencies underpinning their flawless lifestyle. Ah-hai was the necessary catalyst, the non-abstract variable that broke the equation. His ruin, evidenced perhaps by a desperate, unencrypted plea for help intercepted by a junior staffer and shown to Pan Sheng, was the first time the code felt hot in his hands. It was no longer elegant math. It was the direct cause of tangible suffering. This sight ignited a fierce, internal revolt in Pan Sheng, an overwhelming sense of professional betrayal of his own initial standards. His engineering prowess, once a source of pride, became the source of his deepest shame. The covert counter-operation was an exercise in psychological warfare against himself. Every line of defensive code he wrote was a direct admission of guilt, written under the constant threat of exposure. He had to think like Lu Wei, anticipate the surveillance, and use the system's own design flaws, the very inefficiencies he'd once promised to eliminate, as his escape routes. Na Ying, seeing the shift from assured calm to frantic, sleepless energy in Pan Sheng, finally faced the horrifying truth behind their imported comforts, her mathematician's precision recognizing the absolute certainty of their impending danger. When Lu Wei's security apparatus detected the anomalies, not a bug, but an intentional flaw, the atmosphere snapped from opulent control to immediate, visceral threat. Their flight was undignified and terrifying, a scramble stripped of the protective layers of wealth. They were hunted by men who valued efficiency above all else, and Pan Sheng's only advantage was his unparalleled, intimate knowledge of the digital terrain he had so expertly constructed for his tormentor. The final moments were characterized by a raw sense of liberation mixed with crippling despair, realizing that while they might escape the physical enclosure, they carried the indelible blueprint of their moral failure with them, a debt that no code could ever erase. The immediate aftermath of their desperate escape found Pan Sheng and Na Ying stripped bare of the artifice that had defined their relationship and success. They were adrift, hiding in anonymous, low-rent spaces, places where the ambient light lacked the curated warmth of their former penthouse. The silence between them was heavy, not the comfortable quiet of shared understanding, but the charged quiet of shared trauma and unspoken accusation. Pan Sheng felt the constant, phantom vibration of surveillance, every passing unfamiliar vehicle sending jolts of adrenaline through him, a residual effect of living under Lu Wei's omnipresent digital eye. He could no longer look at a screen without a flicker of suspicion, the tools of his genius having become instruments of his downfall. Na Ying, whose mind thrived on order, struggled most visibly with the chaos. She attempted to find solace in the concrete reality of their predicament, perhaps even calculating the probability of Lu Wei finding them, but the variables were too emotionally charged. The intellectual distance she once maintained from the source of their wealth evaporated, leaving her with the full weight of her complicity, a complicity rooted perhaps in ambition or a deep-seated desire for security that now proved utterly illusory. Their intellectual bond, once forged in shared potential, was now tempered by shared guilt, creating a bond that was perhaps stronger, but infinitely more fragile. Pan Sheng understood that survival meant not just physical evasion, but complete systemic disappearance. He began the slow, painful process of dismantling his digital ghost, scrubbing old accounts, altering his gait and appearance in the rare excursions necessary for survival. His brilliance, once aimed at creating inescapable systems, was now focused on creating untraceable voids. He considered contacting authorities, but the chilling effectiveness of Lu Wei's network suggested an influence that stretched far beyond the physical confines of their old operation. Even official channels might be compromised by the sheer amount of illicit capital Lu Wei commanded. The decision to remain hidden was a pragmatic acknowledgement that he had created a power structure too vast and too well connected to fight openly. They were now fugitives, not just from a criminal, but from the very concept of modern, hyper-connected wealth, learning to live in the forgotten, unmonitored margins of the world they had once sought to dominate. Pan Sheng carried the weight of his self-imposed invisibility like a poorly fitting shroud. In the cramped, unremarked rooms they inhabited, far from the sleek minimalism he once commanded, every interaction was layered with mistrust. He'd stare at Na Ying across a cheap, laminate table, seeing not the woman who shared his ambition, but a constant, fragile reminder of the empire he'd engineered and then detonated. His hands, which could once orchestrate billions with a few keystrokes, now trembled slightly when handling mundane objects, a testament to the psychological toll of constant alertness. He obsessed over the small details of their survival, the way a shadow fell, the pattern of trash collection, turning his engineer's focus to the micro-surveillance of ordinary life, a grim parody of his former expertise. Na Ying, for her part, began to channel her mathematical rigor into understanding the human element they had previously ignored. Stripped of the veneer of luxury, she found herself studying the faces of the people around them, the exhausted cashier, the tired bus driver, seeing in their genuine struggles a reflection of the genuine struggle Ah Hai had faced. Her theoretical understanding of human psychology sharpened through necessity. She questioned the nature of security. Was it the abundance of capital or the absence of moral compromise? This internal reckoning was harsh, but it began to slowly rebuild a foundation for her, one based not on acquisitions, but on stark, painful honesty with Pan Sheng. They communicated in clipped sentences, saving energy, each word weighted by the unspoken knowledge of what they had lost and what they had narrowly escaped losing. The necessity of complete digital erasure forced Pan Sheng to confront the totality of his former self. He couldn't just abandon the platform. He had to actively break the threads connecting his digital identity to the world. This meant destroying meticulously crafted data sets, burning bridges to former colleagues who knew him only as the brilliant, dedicated, high-frequency trader. He realized Lu Wei was not just hunting them. He was actively erasing any evidence that Pan Sheng's genius had ever been leveraged for the casino, intending to leave him a ghost with no legitimate past to fall back on. The isolation deepened, transforming from a temporary measure into a potentially permanent state. They were learning to live in the negative space of the digital world, relying on cash transactions and outdated communication methods. The ultimate irony for the architect of a leading-edge online fraud. Their new existence was a continuous act of editing their own lives out of existence. Pan Sheng's decision to embrace complete digital non-existence was a grueling exercise in self-excision. Every deleted file, every wiped server log, felt like tearing a piece of his own identity away. He meticulously avoided any technology associated with his former life. No complex programming languages, no high-speed fiber connections, reverting instead to archaic methods of communication, favoring untraceable burner phones for essential logistical coordination. The irony of a master coder relying on technology designed for anonymity not lost on him. He found a grim satisfaction in this forced simplicity, viewing it as penance for the complexity he had weaponized. The paranoia, however, remained a constant, humming undercurrent. He'd often wake in the dead of night, heart hammering, convinced he heard the faint sound of a remote access program attempting to breach their primitive defenses, a subconscious echo of Lu Wei's persistent reach. Na Ying began seeking small, unmonitored jobs, tasks that required physical presence and zero digital footprint. Anything from sorting inventory in a dusty warehouse to preparing basic food orders. This grounded labor was jarring for someone whose mind was trained in abstract theories, yet it offered a peculiar form of purification. She found a strange sense of stability in predictable, low-stakes physical effort, a counterpoint to the high-variance, zero-sum game she'd participated in alongside Pan Sheng. She watched him, noting the hollowness in his eyes, recognizing that while he had escaped the physical cage, the internal architecture of guilt remained intact. Her affection for him was now intertwined with a fierce, protective pity. She saw the brilliance still flickering there, desperate to be pointed toward something constructive, something that didn't involve breaking or hiding. Their shared space became a crucible where the old relationship died, and a new, perhaps more honest one, struggled to be born. Arguments were rare, replaced by shared glances that conveyed volumes of regret and the terrifying uncertainty of their future. They had nothing left to prove to each other about their respective talents. The market had brutally tested their mettle, and they had both failed the moral test spectacularly. The silence that often fell between them was now less accusatory and more contemplative, an attempt to reconstruct a life based solely on irreducible truths: the need for food, shelter, and the precarious safety of being utterly forgotten by the powerful entities they had once served. They understood with stark clarity that their atonement would not be found in grand gestures, but in the quiet, persistent choice, every single day, to remain small, insignificant, and above all, honest. The small, anonymous town they settled in offered a deceptive blanket of obscurity. It was the kind of place where people kept to themselves, valuing routine over scrutiny, a perfect environment for two people attempting to become ghosts. Pan Sheng deliberately chose employment that utilized his hands rather than his mind, manual labor in a quiet construction yard, where the dust and physical exertion provided a temporary anesthetic for his overactive brain. He learned the language of concrete and steel, a stark contrast to the ephemeral logic, gates, and floating-point arithmetic that had once consumed him. The sheer effort required to lift materials provided a tangible consequence for every action, a welcome relief from the intangible, yet devastating, results of his code. Na Ying, embracing the necessity of rebuilding her intellectual life from the ground up, began volunteering at a local community center, assisting children with basic literacy. Here, the satisfaction was immediate and human scale. Seeing a child grasp a new concept, a small, undeniable victory, offered a sliver of the pride that Pan Sheng once found in optimization, but without the accompanying moral corrosion. She was teaching structure, but a benevolent foundational structure, one built on nurturing potential rather than exploiting weakness. She found herself relating not to the high-flying mathematicians of her past, but to the earnest, struggling parents seeking stability for their families, finally understanding the fragility of the security they had once so carelessly manufactured for themselves. Despite the outward calm, the shadow of Lu Wei lingered, like environmental pollution. Pan Sheng still scanned license plates, still mapped escape routes in his mind, his former skills repurposed for defense. He lived in constant anticipation of the day Lu Wei, using his vast resources, would successfully pierce their digital camouflage. The true test of their atonement, they realized, wouldn't be a dramatic confrontation, but a long, monotonous endurance, the ability to withstand the slow attrition of fear while persistently choosing the harder, quieter path of rebuilding integrity, one unmonitored, honest day at a time. They were survivors learning the painful lesson that true wealth lay not in what could be accumulated and controlled, but in what could be freely given and nothing held back. Pan Sheng's physical labor at the construction site was a form of self-flagellation, each ache a reminder of a misplaced talent. He often found himself sketching intricate circuit diagrams on stray pieces of scrap wood during breaks, only to furiously sand the drawings away, as if the very act of visualizing complex systems was a relapse. He avoided any conversation that veered toward technology or finance, fearing that any expression of his former expertise might act as a homing beacon for Lu Wei's unseen surveillance. His transformation was deeply internal. He was seeking not forgiveness from the outside world, which he believed would never grant it, but a baseline level of functional self-respect. Na Ying's work with the children was her anchor. In the classroom, where patience was valued over processing speed, she discovered a depth of connection she had never found in the sterile halls of academia or the glittering heights of their ill-gotten gains. She noticed one young boy, perpetually distracted, whose struggle mirrored her own initial inability to focus on anything but the most immediate, glittering reward. By patiently breaking down reading into manageable steps, she was teaching him algorithmic thinking applied to language, structure, pattern recognition, and sequential processing. But this time, the output was understanding, not profit. This small act of constructive creation began to thaw the icy shell of her guilt, replacing the cold comfort of wealth with the warm glow of earned utility. Their unspoken agreement was to never discuss the past directly, an unspoken pact to avoid reopening the wounds. Yet, every quiet evening, sharing a meager, home-cooked meal, the air was thick with the ghosts of their choices. Pan Sheng looked at Na Ying and saw the mathematician who had once been so fiercely dedicated to immutable truths, now living a life dependent on the shifting sands of evasion. He understood that their survival was predicated on being utterly uninteresting to the world Lu Wei inhabited, a world that only valued extremes of power or failure. Their new life was a deliberate embrace of the mundane, the gray middle ground, hoping that in their very insignificance, they might finally achieve a lasting peace that no amount of high-frequency coding could ever secure. They were building a life not of towering success, but of quiet, resilient obscurity. The forced obscurity of their new existence began to calcify into a strange sort of routine, a rhythm dictated by need rather than desire. Pan Sheng found that the physical exhaustion he courted offered a shallow but effective defense against the haunting clarity of his memories. He started taking jobs further afield occasionally, leveraging the minimal cash they possessed for bus tickets to distant, equally unremarkable towns. A small, private counter-surveillance exercise designed to throw off any potential tail who might have finally located their initial hideout. He understood that Lu Wei's network operated on scale and pattern recognition. The key to enduring was to become statistically insignificant, a random perturbation in the dataset that was too costly to isolate and pursue indefinitely. This constant state of low-grade vigilance made him lean, quick, and perpetually guarded. The engineer transformed into a survivalist, his greatest software hack now being the art of being truly unseen. Niu Ying's dedication to the children at the center deepened, evolving from a necessary distraction into a genuine vocation. She noticed that the concepts of fairness and consequence, so easily warped in the high-stakes world of digital finance, were crystal clear in the simple moral framework of a child's game. She started developing simple, tangible teaching aids, blocks, simple counting games, objects that existed firmly in the three-dimensional world, resistant to remote manipulation or algorithmic deceit. When a child succeeded through honest effort, the resulting joy was pure, untainted by hidden fees or rigged odds, and Na Ying absorbed that purity like water in dry earth. She realized that while Pan Sheng was hiding from the world, she was beginning to build a small, moral world within their confines, brick by painful brick of genuine interaction. The tension between them remained, a necessary friction that kept them sharp. There were evenings when Pan Sheng would watch Na Ying laugh easily with one of the parents, a sound so unguarded that it momentarily transported him back to the intoxicating days before Lu Wei, and a wave of agonizing regret would wash over him. He knew he had stolen that ease from her, trading genuine connection for a counterfeit opulence. Their intimacy became slower, more deliberate, predicated not on shared excitement, but on shared vulnerability. They communicated their anxieties not through dramatic confessionals, but through minute acts of care, making sure the other ate enough, checking the perimeter of their small rented house before sleeping. Small affirmations that they were still together, choosing the hard path of honesty over the easy descent back into shadows. They were two brilliant minds recalibrating their purpose, learning that the greatest complexity lies not in building a perfect system, but in maintaining an imperfect, honest human connection against overwhelming temptation. The quiet life they painstakingly constructed was inherently fragile, a temporary shelter built on the ruins of catastrophic ambition. Pan Sheng found himself haunted by the ghost of Ah Hai, a specter that no amount of physical exhaustion could banish. He knew that the true measure of his atonement would only be met if he could somehow find a way to offer restitution without exposing himself or Na Ying to the lethal reach of Lu Wei. This internal battle manifested in bouts of obsessive tidiness, as if by imposing perfect order on his immediate, tiny environment, he could somehow negate the global chaos he had unleashed. He began studying rudimentary mechanics, fixing sputtering local machinery, tasks that offered visible, immediate results. A broken pump fixed, a sputtering engine running smoothly. A clean cycle of problem and resolution, diametrically opposed to the perpetual, unseen imbalance of the betting platform. Na Ying's pedagogical success brought a fragile light into their existence, but it also sharpened her awareness of the societal gaps their former wealth had insulated them from. She saw firsthand the desperation that fueled the very desire for quick, illicit riches that had ensnared them. One afternoon, while helping a parent navigate complex, often predatory, local loan applications, a process that relied on a terrifying lack of transparency, Na Ying experienced a stark epiphany. She recognized the same systemic exploitation, just on a smaller, slower scale. The realization that Lu Wei's digital casino was merely a high-velocity mirror of existing economic injustices gave her a new, focused sense of purpose, one that didn't require running or hiding. She started discreetly advising the parents, using her inherent mathematical clarity to decode bureaucratic jargon and highlight unfavorable clauses, essentially providing free, legitimate financial consultancy to the community's most vulnerable. Their shared moments, devoid of grand gestures or luxury, took on an unexpected depth. One evening, while repairing a leak in their shared roof, a mundane necessity, Pan Sheng found himself openly sketching potential architectural improvements for the community center, a genuine, unforced application of his design intellect. Na Ying, watching him, didn't see the criminal mastermind. She saw the engineer, the visionary, channeling his immense power toward repair rather than destruction. In that shared act of practical creation, their unspoken accusation dissolved slightly, replaced by a quiet, mutual acknowledgement of shared suffering and the arduous commitment to a new moral vector. They were no longer just running. They were deliberately, slowly, attempting to build something small and true in the shadow of their massive lie, understanding that the only way to truly defeat the system they built was to live outside its axioms entirely. The small acts of localized repair and genuine contribution began to foster a fragile sense of security, one that was entirely self-generated, unbacked by offshore accounts or layered encryption. However, the world Pan Sheng had fled possessed long memory and sophisticated retrieval methods. One overcast afternoon, while Pan Sheng was working on a particularly stubborn engine component, the rhythmic clang of metal a momentary distraction, a new figure arrived in their quiet town. This man, operating with a quiet professionalism that screamed professional operative rather than local gossip, began asking pointed, subtle questions around the construction yard, inquiries framed around lost equipment or misplaced credentials, subtly probing for any trace of the brilliant engineer who had vanished. Na Ying recognized the pattern instantly, her mathematician's mind mapping the intrusion. The inquiries were too specific, too neatly triangulated to be random suspicion. They bore the hallmark of Lu Wei's methodical search parameters, focused not on physical whereabouts, but on the residual energy signature of Pan Sheng's unique problem-solving aptitude. She noticed the newcomer lingered near the community center, seemingly observing her interactions with the children, perhaps hoping to gauge Pan Sheng's emotional vulnerabilities through her current activities. The realization struck her with chilling force. Lu Wei wasn't just hunting a runaway programmer. He was hunting the talent, believing that if he couldn't control Pan Sheng, he could at least force him back through leveraging the only thing he now seemed to value: Na Ying's safety. The atmosphere instantly reverted to the high-stakes tension of their past. The mundane suddenly felt like a thin membrane stretched over an abyss. Pan Sheng, alerted by Na Ying's sudden, uncharacteristic silence and sharp sidelong glances, immediately shifted into defensive protocol, his survival instincts overriding his desire for manual labor anonymity. He recognized the operator's calculated movements. This was not a thug, but an extension of Lu Wei's own system, efficient, untraceable, and utterly ruthless. The time for quiet atonement had been abruptly suspended. They were faced with the terrible inevitability. One cannot truly escape a system one has mastered without confronting its relentless logic one last time, forcing Pan Sheng to consider weaponizing the very knowledge he had sworn to suppress, not for wealth, but for the desperate, final defense of the fragile life they had managed to carve out of the wreckage. The reappearance of Lu Wei's shadow shattered the fragile peace with the cold precision of a system failure alarm. Pan Sheng felt an icy clarity flood his system, overriding the dull ache of physical labor. He watched Na Ying across the small, cluttered room they rented, noting the subtle tightening around her eyes, the mathematical certainty of danger overriding her newfound composure. The operative hadn't needed brute force. He had simply introduced a controlled variable into their otherwise inert environment. Pan Sheng instantly recognized the operator's methodology. Lu Wei was testing the perimeter by applying pressure where Pan Sheng had built his moral anchors. Pan Sheng retreated into himself, his focus narrowing with terrifying intensity. He didn't speak, understanding that any spoken plan could be compromised. Instead, he began an intricate, silent audit of their current surroundings, his mind instantly overlaying their physical reality with digital vulnerabilities. He saw the cheap Wi-Fi router, the proximity of the local municipal network, the pattern of the single landline in the community center. He was designing a defense, not in lines of elegant C++, but in physical actions and strategic misdirection. The shame of returning to his old skill set warred with the primal need to protect Na Ying, and the need to protect one, staining his nascent atonement with the bitterness of necessary regression. Na Ying met his silent intensity, not with fear, but with a fierce, calculating resolve. She understood that Pan Sheng's knowledge was the only currency they possessed that Lu Wei couldn't immediately counter with money. She took the lead in managing the periphery, using her practiced composure to interact with the subtle threat. When the operative approached her under the guise of asking for local directions, Na Ying offered him meticulously crafted disinformation, a route leading to a nearby town notorious for poor reception, a manufactured anecdote about an eccentric former resident who had recently moved, all delivered with the warm, slightly scatterbrained sincerity of a community volunteer. It was a psychological feint, buying Pan Sheng precious hours. The knowledge that their small, honest life was now the target ignited a desperate fire in Pan Sheng. He realized the fight wouldn't be won by hiding deeper. It required a direct, surgical strike at the means of surveillance. He couldn't rebuild the fortress, but he could build a single, devastating piece of digital shrapnel. Working late into the night, using nothing more than a prepaid laptop purchased with untraceable cash, and accessing public library terminals under cover of darkness, Pan Sheng began constructing a highly specialized, self-propagating logic bomb. This was not the subtle optimization of before. This was an act of calculated chaos designed to cause massive, untraceable systemic failure within Lu Wei's tracking infrastructure. A final, desperate act of digital sabotage meant to buy them not wealth, but the priceless commodity of time and silence, even if it meant sentencing himself to a life forever looking over his shoulder. The act of coding this logic bomb, a digital term of annihilation he hadn't uttered in years, felt like an exorcism performed under duress. Pan Sheng treated the laptop not as a tool of genius, but as a poisoned needle, preparing a dose intended for a leviathan. The library terminals, smelling faintly of dust and stale coffee, were his confessional booth. He wrote the code with a terrifying efficiency, stripping away all elegance, focusing purely on maximum destructive impact against Lu Wei's proprietary tracking matrices. There was a fleeting, perverse pride in the tightness of the malware. It was mathematically pure, but its purpose was ugly, engineered entropy. He wasn't trying to win. He was trying to create a blinding flash of confusion so intense that their local insignificance would become statistically valid noise again, buying them months, perhaps years, in the ensuing chaos. Na Ying watched the change in him with a mixture of terror and grudging admiration. The quiet, earnest laborer had vanished, replaced by the coiled intensity of the early days, but now tempered by profound moral clarity. She was his human firewall, the one tethered to the tangible world. While Pan Sheng hunted Lu Wei's digital ghost, Na Ying focused on the physical threat, observing the operative's routines. She noted his reliance on digital check-ins, his reliance on the network for status updates, the Achilles heel of any centralized, efficient operation. She mapped his patrol routes against the town's antiquated municipal camera blind spots, finding the digital operative's physical weaknesses in the analog world he was forced to inhabit. Their communication became an intricate dance of shorthand and gesture, blending their opposing skill sets seamlessly. When Pan Sheng muttered a fragment about needing a stable broadcast window, Na Ying knew he needed a distraction coinciding with the town's weekly, brief local emergency siren test, a moment when ambient electronic noise was high and localized attention was momentarily diverted. When she subtly placed a specific brand of cheap, common cigarette ash near the operative's usual resting spot, Pan Sheng understood. The threat was stationary and predictable, momentarily susceptible to chemical distraction. They were operating as a two-person, low-tech, high-concept counterintelligence cell, fueled by shared desperation and a profound shared horror of returning to the gilded cage. The climax of their preparation arrived on the night Pan Sheng initiated the sequence. He didn't need a grand, theatrical upload. A single, carefully masked connection during the siren test, hidden within a surge of legitimate, system-wide municipal data traffic, was enough. As the wail of the siren ripped through the small town, masking the faintest digital echo, Pan Sheng executed the payload. He watched the library terminal screen, not for a confirmation message, but for the lack of any immediate, responsive error message. For one heart-stopping minute, nothing happened. Then, as the siren faded, Pan Sheng saw a flicker on a dimly lit local news feed accessed through an untargeted peripheral connection. Reports of widespread, inexplicable data corruption across several major financial exchange nodes. A digital tremor felt across Lu Wei's global interests. They had not destroyed the behemoth, but they had, for a glorious, terrifying moment, blinded its eyes. The emotional fallout was instantaneous, an adrenaline crash followed by a profound, exhausted sense of finality. They had burned their last bridge. There was no going back to the quiet life now. They had provoked the dragon, and now they had to run faster than they had ever run before, knowing Lu Wei would interpret this targeted chaos not as a plea for peace, but as the ultimate declaration of war. The narrative thrust of No More Bets, a film deeply entrenched in the contemporary anxieties surrounding online fraud, establishes a grim, unforgiving landscape from its opening frames. It is not merely a procedural exposé of phishing scams or cryptocurrency exploitation. Rather, it functions as a cautionary tale, meticulously detailing the psychological manipulation inherent in these sophisticated operations. The film centers on the trajectory of its protagonist, a young, ambitious programmer who finds himself increasingly entangled in a sprawling transnational cybercrime syndicate operating under the guise of legitimate tech investment. The initial seduction into this world mirrors classic narratives of misplaced trust and unchecked ambition. The protagonist, possessing genuine technical acumen, a skill set often celebrated in modern society, is quickly redirected from ethical innovation to illicit enterprise. This transition is portrayed with unsettling realism, highlighting how easily intellectual capability can be weaponized when coupled with financial desperation or a yearning for rapid success. The film draws effectively from real-world headlines, echoing the chilling efficiency described in reports on overseas cyber-slavery operations, particularly those based in Southeast Asia, where victims are coerced into performing digital cons. Central to the film's success is its depiction of the internal mechanics of these scam centers. They are presented less as chaotic dens of criminality and more as highly structured, almost corporate environments. The management, often portrayed as cold, calculating figures reminiscent of low-level Silicon Valley executives, but stripped of any pretense of positive contribution, enforces quotas and demands absolute obedience. This corporate veneer serves to dehumanize both the operators and their targets. For the operators, the repetitive nature of their assigned roles, crafting convincing emotional scripts, managing multiple fake identities, dulls any inherent moral compass, reducing human interaction to a series of exploitable data points. The counterpoint to this organized villainy is the plight of the victims, often depicted through fragmented glimpses of their despair. One particularly effective sequence involves an older character, perhaps a retired school teacher or small business owner, whose life savings are systematically drained. The film avoids melodrama here, focusing instead on the quiet horror of realization, the slow dawning that every reassuring phone call, every carefully worded promise of return on investment, was a lie meticulously constructed by someone on the other side of the world. This forces the viewer to confront the immediacy and accessibility of digital predation. The film's visual language often mirrors the psychological state of the characters. Inside the scam compounds, the lighting is typically harsh and artificial, reflecting the unreality of their manufactured world. Conversely, when the protagonist attempts to communicate with the outside world, perhaps through fleeting moments of contact with family or law enforcement, the visuals often become blurry or distorted, symbolizing the compromised nature of truth and connection in his compromised position. The influence of earlier crime thrillers, particularly those focused on complex financial deception, is palpable. Yet, No More Bets updates this template by anchoring the conflict firmly in the digital realm, where physical distance no longer offers protection. The authorities struggle to penetrate these networks, often stymied by jurisdictional barriers and the sheer volume of digital evidence that must be sifted, underscores the inadequacy of traditional law enforcement models against fluid, borderless crime. The film suggests that technological innovation has far outpaced regulatory and investigative capacity. Ultimately, the film functions as a necessary, albeit uncomfortable, reflection on modern digital vulnerability. It doesn't offer easy heroism or neat resolutions. The lingering impression is one of systemic fragility. How easily our reliance on digital trust, our inherent desire for connection and prosperity, can be mapped and exploited by those operating with utter impunity outside the established norms of societal accountability. It is a narrative that demands vigilance, not just in protecting one's passwords, but in questioning the seductive promise of overnight riches presented through a screen. The narrative truly gains its unsettling power when it delves into the personal toll exacted on the syndicate's own workers. Our programmer, initially driven by a perceived opportunity to outsmart a flawed system, quickly finds himself trapped not by physical chains alone, but by overwhelming debt obligations enforced by the management. This transition from aspiring technologist to indentured servant is crucial. The film makes it clear that the perpetrators are often just one rung above the victims on the ladder of exploitation. We see glimpses of the programmer's internal conflict, perhaps a memory of his university days, fueled by idealism and a genuine desire to build something meaningful, now suffocated by the fluorescent hum of the call center. His handler, a character who embodies the chilling efficiency of the middle management within the syndicate, often serves as the film's most terrifying face of normalcy. This figure, perhaps a former local hustler who leveraged his social engineering skills into a management role, maintains a facade of paternal concern while ruthlessly enforcing targets. Their conversations are rarely about threats. They are framed in the cold, impersonal language of performance reviews and quarterly earnings, which somehow makes the underlying cruelty far more potent. It's a deliberate inversion of the supportive mentorship sought by young professionals entering any industry. The film excels at portraying the sheer monotony and psychological exhaustion inherent in maintaining the deception. We follow the scriptwriters tasked with crafting endless narratives of false romance or urgent business needs. The actors playing the roles of grieving relatives or successful investors must deliver convincing emotional performances day in and day out, fostering a profound sense of moral detachment. This constant performance erodes their own capacity for genuine human feeling, suggesting that prolonged immersion in fraud inevitably contaminates the self. The physical environment reflects this. Small, airless rooms where the only window to the outside world is a glowing monitor, displaying fabricated success stories or desperate pleas. The emotional arc of a victim who fights back, even subtly, provides necessary dramatic tension. Consider the elderly woman whose grandson, perhaps a young man in a different city, begins to notice discrepancies in her communications or finances. These moments of external interference, a suspicious bank teller, a relative noticing unusual behavior, are treated with high-stakes urgency by the syndicate, as they represent cracks in their carefully constructed reality. The film handles these counter-investigations with the same tension usually reserved for police raids, emphasizing that for the syndicate, maintaining the illusion is paramount to survival. The cinematic portrayal of the protagonist's eventual realization that there is no clean exit, that the very skills he possesses are the bars of his prison, is marked by a distinct shift in the color palette, moving perhaps from the slightly vibrant, ambitious tones of his early scenes to a washed-out grayness once fully embedded. This visual decay mirrors the internal breakdown. His attempts to subtly sabotage the operation or pass information are fraught with peril, as the syndicate's internal security protocols, learned from years of evading international law enforcement, are airtight. The final confrontation, when it arrives, is less a physical brawl and more a desperate race against the deletion of critical server data, underscoring that in this new frontier of crime, information is the ultimate battlefield. The film leaves the viewer with the unsettling feeling that even if the immediate cell is dismantled, the underlying infrastructure, the global demand for digital quick fixes, and the ease of technological deployment remains poised to spawn the next iteration of the scam. The film's power lies in its refusal to paint the victims as simple fools, a common trope in less thoughtful crime dramas. Instead, the targeted individuals, ranging from recent immigrants trying to establish a foothold to retirees safeguarding decades of labor, are shown to be victims of meticulous psychological profiling. The syndicate employs algorithms, perhaps adapted from genuine market research tools, to identify optimal targets based on factors like recent life changes, expressed anxieties, or documented patterns of online engagement, vulnerability as a quantifiable metric. This personalization of the scam heightens the sense of inescapable doom for the viewer. If this level of data analysis can be used against them, no one is truly safe. The emotional core often resides in the periphery, within the families of those defrauded. We see glimpses of marital strain, the shame felt by a parent who thought they were financially astute, or the strain on a caregiver forced to manage the fallout of ruinous debt. These secondary characters embody the collateral damage, illustrating how cybercrime is not a victimless activity confined to a computer screen, but a profound societal fracture. The film dedicates significant time to showing the impact on mental health, the depression, the paranoia that follows, the inability to trust any future online interaction, a slow, pervasive poisoning of the digital age experience. Furthermore, the internal hierarchy within the scam operation itself is a study in perverse incentives. Characters who show exceptional aptitude for manipulating emotions are rewarded with better living conditions, a slightly cleaner bunk, slightly better rations, creating a perverse competition for moral degradation. One particularly memorable figure, perhaps a former literature student forced into the role of romance scammer, uses elevated, almost poetic language in their cons. This character's internal monologues, perhaps delivered while staring out at a heavily guarded perimeter fence, reveal a bitter self-loathing. They are fully aware of the beautiful lie they are weaving, and their technical proficiency has ironically doomed them to a life of artistic perversion. The investigative elements, though often frustratingly slow, effectively showcase the geopolitical labyrinth that these syndicates inhabit. The local police chief, depicted as a weary veteran fighting outdated battles, constantly clashes with representatives from international bodies who speak in bureaucratic shorthand about extradition treaties and data sovereignty. This contrast emphasizes the theme that the crime has evolved beyond the capacity of existing governance structures to contain it. The physical raids, when they finally occur, are anticlimactic in a satisfying way. They dismantle one physical hub, but the sheer volume of encrypted data, scattered across servers in jurisdictions offering sanctuary, implies that the organization is already reconstituting itself elsewhere, perhaps under a new, subtly different financial scheme. No More Bets succeeds because it treats the technology not as magic, but as scalable logistics. The emotional artistry required to pull off a convincing, long-term high-value scam is emphasized just as much as the coding required to build the fraudulent platforms. It is a film that argues the greatest threat in the modern world is not a lack of information, but the weaponization of human empathy and the industrialized scale at which deception can now be manufactured and deployed globally, leaving behind trails of shattered trust that may never fully mend. The film ultimately pivots from documenting the mechanics of the fraud to exploring the fragile, often desperate attempts at escape or retribution by those trapped within the system. For the protagonist, the drive to leave transitions from a vague sense of moral discomfort to an urgent survival imperative once he realizes that his intimate knowledge of the operation makes him either an indispensable asset or a critical liability. This internal conflict manifests in acts of calculated risk, manipulating system logs to create false audit trails, feeding just enough verifiable, low-level information to external contacts to sow seeds of doubt in the syndicate's security protocols, all while maintaining the facade of unwavering loyalty. The environment surrounding escape attempts is depicted with suffocating intensity. Any communication outside the secure compound is monitored with near omniscience. We see sequences where simple actions, a furtive glance at a phone screen hidden beneath a desk, a coded message passed through a seemingly innocuous repair request, carry the weight of life and death. The sheer paranoia permeating the workforce creates a secondary layer of danger. Fellow workers, driven by the fear of disappointing management or being implicated in a colleague's failure, become potential informants, turning the shared misery into a Darwinian struggle for temporary survival. The narrative occasionally flashes forward, offering brief, stark glimpses into the aftermath for the victims who manage to retain some semblance of their former lives. These snippets are devastating precisely because they are incomplete, a shot of a recovered savings account balance that is still significantly lower than the initial loss, or an adult child struggling to help an aging parent navigate the complex bureaucracy of reporting digital identity theft, underscores the film's central thesis. These crimes leave permanent scars even when the immediate threat is neutralized. The recovery is not a return to the status quo, but an arduous negotiation with the wreckage. The film's commentary on the role of global cooperation, or lack thereof, is subtly woven into the background noise of the investigative threads. The frustration felt by the few dedicated law enforcement officials is palpable. They are often portrayed as being one step behind, dealing with evidence that has already been digitally scrubbed or transferred across multiple shell corporations registered in obscure jurisdictions. This bureaucratic friction serves as a powerful antagonist, highlighting that technological evasion is often supported by legal and political loopholes, granting the transnational criminals a de facto sanctuary that no single nation's police force can effectively breach. The true villain in this context is not just the individual scammer, but the fragmented, slow-moving architecture of international law enforcement struggling to catch up to the speed of digital capital flight. The climax of the protagonist's internal struggle is rendered not through grand cinematic explosions, but through a moment of quiet, almost bureaucratic sabotage. Having gained temporary access to higher administrative privileges, a small victory earned through months of meticulously feigned compliance and data optimization, he chooses his moment of severance. This isn't a righteous vigilante strike. It's the calculated action of an engineer dismantling a flawed system from within. The fear driving him is multi-layered. Fear of capture by the syndicate, fear of legal repercussions for his own complicity, and the raw, primal fear of being permanently erased from the legitimate world he once inhabited. The sequence involving the mass data upload and subsequent system crash feels less like action and more like a necessary digital amputation, painful and risky, yet vital for self-preservation. His eventual extraction, if it occurs, is suitably ambiguous and fraught with peril. It often involves leveraging an unlikely alliance, perhaps an outsider journalist who has doggedly pursued the story from the outside, or a disillusioned former syndicate employee who defected earlier. This external helper is usually depicted as operating on the fringes of legitimacy themselves, underscoring the grim reality that sometimes fighting networked crime requires operating outside conventional boundaries. The rendezvous point is rarely safe, often set in a densely populated but anonymous transit hub, highlighting the transient and rootless existence forced upon those who cross these powerful, criminal entities. The character of the syndicate leader, when finally revealed in full, avoids the typical caricature of a ruthless kingpin. Instead, this figure often embodies a philosophy of radical, almost nihilistic efficiency. Perhaps they are a disillusioned former venture capitalist or an academic who specialized in game theory, viewing human avarice and trust as predictable inputs in an exploitable equation. Their motivation is less about traditional wealth accumulation and more about proving the superiority of their system over conventional societal structures. In a pivotal scene, perhaps a face-to-face confrontation with the protagonist, the leader might articulate a chilling defense of their operation. "We are simply optimizing for human weakness. Society taught them to trust the digital handshake. We merely formalize the transaction." This intellectual justification for profound immorality is far more unsettling than simple greed. The lasting emotional impact of no more bets resides in the uncertainty of rehabilitation. Even if the protagonist escapes the physical compound and provides testimony, the film resists offering a neat redemption arc. The audience is left contemplating the professional impossibility of the programmer rejoining the legitimate tech industry. His unique, albeit illicit, expertise now forever marks him as compromised. The film suggests that once one has mastered the architecture of large-scale digital deceit, the capacity for that knowledge to infect one's future choices remains potent. The closing frames often linger on the protagonist, not celebrating freedom, but staring blankly at a new, ostensibly safe computer screen, the muscle memory of deception still lingering in his fingertips, illustrating that the true prison of cybercrime is often the mind itself. The film's exploration of the aftermath is perhaps its most sophisticated element, delving into the labyrinthine process of legal repatriation and psychological recovery for those who manage to escape the overseas compounds. The protagonist, once extracted, is immediately thrust into a world where his testimony is both invaluable and deeply suspect. He is no longer a victim in the eyes of some authorities. His programming skills mean he is perceived as an expert accomplice, a necessary evil whose cooperation is transactional rather than empathetic. The interrogation scenes are masterfully handled, utilizing claustrophobic framing to emphasize the pressure placed upon him to recall encrypted pathways and management structures that were deliberately kept opaque. The psychological toll on the escapees is meticulously examined through the lens of extreme social anxiety. Having lived in a fabricated reality governed by rigid scripts and constant surveillance, the simplicity of normal life, choosing groceries, engaging in casual conversation, becomes overwhelming. We see him flinch at unexpected noises, interpreting routine administrative procedures as potential traps. The film uses the concept of performance fatigue as a constant specter. His mind, conditioned to constantly monitor tone, body language, and micro-expressions for signs of betrayal or command, cannot switch off this high-alert state, making genuine connection nearly impossible. A crucial subplot often involves the plight of the syndicate's lower-level operatives, the actual call center workers who, like the protagonist, were often lured or forced into the system. The film refuses to treat them as monolithic villains. Instead, it highlights the desperation that drove them. Students saddled with insurmountable educational debt, individuals from regions with few economic prospects. Their fate upon arrest or rescue is often depicted as tragically uncertain, They face long prison sentences abroad or return home to face social ostracism and the accusation that they chose complicity over hardship. This nuance complicates the viewer's moral landscape, forcing a consideration of systemic poverty as a primary recruitment tool for transnational crime. The ultimate indictment delivered by No More Bets is aimed at the global economic structure that enables this exploitation. The film subtly connects the high demand for quick digital profits, driving the scams on the victim side, with the readily available pool of cheap, desperate labor on the supply side. The syndicate's sophisticated technology is merely the efficient processing layer between two forms of desperation. The final moments often avoid triumphalism. Perhaps the protagonist is seen attending a required counseling session or working a low-skill manual job, a deliberate contrast to the complex digital world he once commanded. The camera lingers on his hands, no longer typing code, but performing repetitive, purely physical labor, symbolizing a forced regression, a necessary but painful scrubbing clean of digital contamination, suggesting that true freedom requires not just physical escape, but the complete erasure of learned criminal expertise. The lingering resonance of the film stems from its exploration of digital ghosts and the haunting persistence of online identities. Even after the physical dismantling of a major operation, the digital footprints remain, morphing and re-emerging. The protagonist's attempts to permanently erase his involvement are constantly undermined by the nature of the internet itself. Immutable records, cached data, and the simple fact that another group, perhaps operating under a different, even more sophisticated legal shield, is already using the exact same infrastructure. This suggests a cyclical nature to the crisis, where shutting down one node merely forces the organism to metastasize elsewhere. We see this haunting embodied in the victim's continuing digital lives. A recurring motif involves a victim attempting to reconnect with a lost digital friend, perhaps the fake romantic interest who groomed them, only to find the account has vanished, leaving behind nothing but old, emotionally charged text logs. This forces the viewer to confront the reality that the emotional manipulation was so profound that the relationship, though entirely fabricated, leaves genuine grief, a kind of digital bereavement. The film cleverly uses the technology designed for connection as the medium for this lasting psychological trauma. The internal landscape of the syndicate's leadership often reveals a deep-seated contempt for the very systems they exploit. One particular antagonist, perhaps the syndicate's chief technology officer, a figure possessing the cold brilliance often attributed to early tech pioneers, is shown living an ascetic, almost monastic life outside the compound, entirely disconnected from the material gains of the operation. Their satisfaction derives purely from the intellectual exercise, proving that human predictability is a constant, regardless of cultural or geographical context. This detachment elevates the conflict beyond mere financial crime into a philosophical challenge against societal trust protocols. The tension is further amplified by the constant threat of re-recruitment. Chikari. For highly skilled individuals like the protagonist, the syndicate rarely resorts to brute force for long-term containment. Instead, they leverage the carrot and the stick simultaneously, maintaining hidden access to the escapees' financial records or personal data, promising a clean slate if they can be persuaded to return for a special project, or threatening to expose their past complicity to the authorities who facilitated their release. This hostage situation, maintained through digital leverage rather than physical chains, demonstrates the sophisticated understanding the criminals have of modern vulnerability. The fear of a ruined future outweighs the fear of immediate punishment. In its final analysis, No More Bets is less a critique of technology and more a searing indictment of unchecked capitalism's shadow side, the globalization of labor exploitation rendered seamless by digital tools. It functions as a mirror, reflecting the audience's own hurried digital existence, where the promise of